Thank you so much, Karen, and thank you to everybody for being here this afternoon. I'm really honored to speak to all of you under the auspices of Plato, and so I want to thank Karen, but also Jana Morlone, another person who I knew from the University of Washington as the executive director of this incredible group that I've been watching grow and grow over the last 25 years. It's really exciting. I'm going to make a confession. I do not teach philosophy to children. And so some of the things that are going to come about today are just going to be ways of getting us into thinking about aesthetics generally, and then utilizing your understandings and interests and Karen's expertise to try to figure out how we might take some of these ideas and spin them into really interesting discussions or conversations in all kinds of different groups with all kinds of different age groups. I'd like you to know that what I offer in the first 10 minutes is just kind of a whirlwind tour of things. And anything I say should be merely taken as a prompt and not as a philosophical parameter. So when it comes to discussion time, please feel free to ask anything. I probably don't have the answers, but I could come up with another question. So I'm going to go ahead and share screen and bring you into my world for just about 10 minutes or so. Can you see this, Karen? Yep.
Yes.
Okay. So there it is. Here it is, the obligatory slide. But I'm going to put my cards on the table. I find this inquiry unhelpful in a context like this one, for reasons that we can certainly discuss in our chat session. So instead, let's replace this with what I think is a better question. Now, why is this a better question? Well, let's just consider your day so far as a way to start and get involved. I can't tell if you can see. Think about choosing your outfit, what you had for lunch, when you stopped to drink in a bit of nature around work, what you posted on social media, what kinds of objects decorate your office, what music you might have heard in an elevator, how an old building might have struck you as you walked across campus, and so forth. So I think the better question is why aesthetics? Because in getting people interested in the various issues that we deal with in this field, we should start with our own experiences, and we all have tons of them every day. So what kind of role have aesthetic matters played in your day, not just broadly speaking, but also in your decision making? Or how has aesthetics, broadly construed because not yet defined, made a significant difference to the character of your experiences, maybe even to the way you've learned? And we could ask similar kinds of questions about a distinction that aestheticians often make between the aesthetic and the artistic, or the aesthetic, broadly speaking, that which comes in through the senses, and the artistic, that which is usually connected to some set of institutions or intentions to be part of a community that's continuing forward certain kinds of artful crafts. I will say that this is a really interesting distinction in aesthetics. It's highly controversial. So you might not have to ask both questions, or you might have to ask more questions than this. But at very least, I think those questions are better than what is aesthetics, in large part because even aestheticians have no idea, and they're in philosophical debate over this consistently. So in what follows, what I want to do is take the question, why aesthetics? And in answering it, I'm going to make three very, very broad, very bold claims about the character of philosophical aesthetics, which will take us to about the end of the 10-minute preliminary overview. And then we can pause and chat. But I also have a set of resources that I think are useful in any context when we're thinking about philosophy and art and aesthetics. And I'm happy to not only share those, but also provide a sort of timely puzzle case that might get us thinking about these things even more. So, to the bold claims, completely unsubstantiated. Here we go. So, bold claim number one, aesthetics is experientially pervasive, or the slogan, aesthetics is everywhere. And you could just take this smattering of images as a kind of evidence that speaks to this point. We have phones, food, films, furniture, fictions, photographs, flowers, landscapes, lithographs, perfumes, parties, paintings, performances, cars, Comic-Cons, commercials, collage art, you can tell I like Sondheim, and so forth. I could go on and on, almost ad infinitum. So the idea here is just that our lives are simply shot through with things that have aesthetic dimensions, that engage us in aesthetic contemplation, that play on whatever we regard as aesthetic judgment, as well as things that have artistic properties and engage us in various kinds of artistic enterprises. And the very pervasiveness then of these things is at least the beginning of an answer to the question, why aesthetics? Or maybe a related question, what kinds of things should aestheticians be interested in? This, of course, makes it look like almost everything, right? Second bold claim, aesthetics is philosophically expansive. And by this, I just mean that aesthetics engages all areas of philosophy. This isn't a controversial claim, actually, in any way. It's really just a description of how this discipline works. So aestheticians have to know something, at least, about almost all other philosophical domains, because our questions actually intersect with almost all of them. And actually, as you could see from the little article I posted, if you had the chance to read it, we often borrow or co-opt tools from other disciplines. But by contrast, people who study at least some other areas of philosophy, such as logic or analytic metaphysics, they might be able to work almost exclusively in their own domain, and they certainly wouldn't need to know anything at all about philosophical aesthetics. And I'll be honest, lots of them don't. But here are a few ways that aesthetic inquiries almost immediately will take us into other larger, perhaps more highly recognized areas of philosophy. So perhaps you're interested in how metaphors mean because you're working on some sort of interpretive endeavor regarding T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. You find yourself immediately in the philosophy of language. Or you can fall into epistemology extremely easily, which is just to say the theory of knowledge, if you're wondering what, if anything at all, we could learn from a work of art, particularly given that artworks are generally creatures of the imagination. They involve, we hope, high levels of novel creativity, and many of them have fictional components. So they do look perhaps suspicious as sources of evidence for knowledge about the world. In almost every area of aesthetics, you're going to find some set of questions that deal more broadly with what we call value theory or sometimes axiology. So here's one example. Beauty is often thought of as one of the central historical issues dealt with by aestheticians, though I'll tell you a secret, contemporary philosophers almost never talk about beauty anymore. But historically, it was a really central concept. And of course, if beauty is a kind of value or a good at adding thing to the world, we might want to wonder how it figures in a theory of value in general, whether it's hierarchically ordered with other values, whether it's one of many, or whether, as some philosophers would hold, it is the prime value, and everything else, including moral value, Karen, is subsumed under the value of beauty. I can fall into metaphysics or ontology any day of the week about any kind of aesthetic or artistic object you like, because this is actually my secondary discipline, and you can too. So if you're reading J.K. Rowling novels and you're wondering, does Harry Potter exist? You might think, well, the answer to that is pretty obvious. In some sense, there's a character by the name of Harry Potter that figures in those 7 books written by Rowling. But if Harry Potter does exist, in what way, qua fictional character? Presumably not in the same way I exist. And also, how would we individuate the Harry Potter of the Rowling books from, say, the versions of Harry Potter we might find maybe in the movies? Perhaps it's the same entity, perhaps not. But certainly individuate that character from entities we might find in various forms of fan fiction. Aesthetics and moral philosophy is always right next to and deeply engaged with almost everything we do in aesthetics. It's kind of the sister set of disciplines. Here's one of the central questions that philosophers in aesthetics have a tendency to debate with great regularity. I put it in kind of a formal way, is the artistic merit of a creative product related to its moral point of view. But we could say that much more simply. If an artwork, maybe like Lolita, asks you as an audience member to adopt an immoral point of view as part of understanding its content, is it thereby flawed in some way artistically? Which is to say, is its moral content or the moral perspective it propounds in any way related to its artistic value? Or are these things completely independent of one another. And finally, many of you might know that aesthetics is actually from Greek terms, aesthesis or aesthetikos, depending on your preference, referencing perception or things that are taken in through the senses. And we hardly, as a discipline, can get away from thinking about all kinds of perception and philosophy of perception, which is now often very regularly paired with work done on the ground in cognitive science. And so the version of a question I posed here is actually one I deal with in my own work in philosophy of dance, wondering how kinesthesia, or our sort of bodily responses to certain kinds of presented experiences or presented artistic offerings, could play a role in our aesthetic or artistic judgment. I think it's clear that they do, and then the question is, should they, and is that something that we should foster? But there would be a whole huge range of questions about from philosophy of perception that aestheticians would be dealing with too. So the question I had on the table was really why aesthetics, and this is a personal answer. Why aesthetics? Because I get to learn about all the other areas of philosophy too, while pretending to do research, going to the theater and reading novels. So if I had to sell an area of philosophy to you on any grounds for your weekend time, I think this is definitely the one. That moves us into my third bold claim, which is that, at least from my perspective and in my experience with other practicing estheticians, aesthetics is personally and interpersonally significant. And I think it's that second piece that really matters. In other words, aesthetic matters, whatever these are in the final estimation, matter to us. This, I take it, is actually a kind of implicit theme in James Shelley's little piece that I gave you, if you had a chance to look at it, called Is Beauty Subjective? And I offered this in this context because James, who's the current president of the American Society for Aesthetics, posted it in our summer newsletter as a way of preparing all of us to go back to teaching in the fall. And it's a little article essay that he wrote for his students to try to get them engaged in aesthetics on the first day in an intro course. I think that implicit in his little reflection piece is actually something like the following. He notes first that it's common for people to come into the discipline thinking that there's no philosophy to be done here because there's this pervasive set of platitudes, like there's no disputing in matters of taste, or the one he focuses on, beauty's in the eye of the beholder. And at one point in the little essay, Shelley emphasizes that even those who make these claims and who make them in good faith and take them very, very seriously might not really be comfortable embracing the kind of subjectivism that these truisms really imply when we investigate them. Because it seems that at least this sort of eye of the beholder subjectivism, or what's sometimes called naive subjectivism, will immediately make it the case that there are no more genuine disagreements about works of art or aesthetic objects, and consequently, as Shelley points out, no more genuine agreements either. And so the idea that he raises very quickly represented here is just sort of a situation like the following. We have Joan, who finds the new movie Wicked emotionally gripping and in some sense socially trenchant. And so to that extent, it's true that Joan finds the film beautiful. For her, the film is beautiful and perhaps aesthetically valuable, whichever, or artistically valuable, whatever the relevant descriptor is going to be here. Joan's friend Maya finds Wicked tiresome, being more than 5 hours long, for goodness sakes, and trite, since it's one of only many, many retellings of the story of the Oz world. So it's a truism that for Maya, the film isn't beautiful or artistically valuable. Now, if the eye of the beholder version of subjectivism is true, and this is the one that students tend to embrace when they walk into the classroom, then we don't really have any interesting disagreement between Joan and Maya. Joan acknowledges that Maya finds Wicked not beautiful or artistically valuable, and Maya acknowledges that Joan does. And that's about the end of it. There's not a lot more that we can say because there is nothing outside of their own experiences or evaluations of the work that are functioning to buttress a claim about its quality or its beauty or its value. So this leaves us in a position where one question we might ask is, well, what can we say about what's true of the value of Wicked, the movie itself, right? Has Joan got it closer to right? Maya? Are they both wrong? And it looks like we have a very difficult time engaging a question of that nature if this sort of eye of beholder subjectivism is true. That's a pretty natural question to ask. I think probably more importantly for James Shelley, and certainly more importantly for me, is that if you thought this kind of eye of beholder subjectivism is true, you'd have to come up against the question of whether we can really give up our commitment to the idea of pretty substantial forms of disagreement this easily. Are we happy with that? Can we tell a different story about what's going on when Maya and Joan seem to have an impassioned debate over the value of Wicked? And I think what actually is at stake here, though this is not something Shelley says in the piece I gave you, is that we care about how to make sense of the importance of sharing our artistic and aesthetic lives with others, and how to make sense of what that would look like if agreements of a substantial kind and disagreements of a substantial kind are no longer really part of what we're doing when we're talking to each other about these parts of our lives. And in fact, it seems to me, and I think to James, that we do engage in passionate discussion about artworks or aesthetic values in a way that suggests we think there is something we are disagreeing about, and that that something is worth fighting for in order to get others to, quote, see the evidence. That is, to see a beloved artistic or aesthetic object in the very way that we do, even just for a moment. And so, again, the concern comes back for me to aesthetic community. Sometimes we value works of art just because our friends find them valuable. And we want to see what they see to get to know our friends in the world a little bit better. And we trust that our friends see something in them that's there to be seen. But equally, sometimes we come to develop friendships with folks who would otherwise just remain strangers, precisely because we agree in what seems like some fundamental way on certain aesthetic merits of the world, or perhaps have certain similar artistic interests. Oops. In addition, we often work hard, and I think this is the crucial point, to help to transform each other's experiences, sharing not just details of our perceptual encounters, but also letting others into our emotional lives, our ethical commitments, our worldviews, and our collective human vulnerability, as we try to come to grips together with fractured perspective in a Picasso painting, or unearth the many mysterious meanings of a T.S. Eliot poem, explore perhaps an immersive whole world of VR, or simply stand on the edge of a vast ocean, looking out to the sunset, collectively humbled. So, to conclude just this part, I think what's at stake, and part of the answer to why aesthetics, is the following. We both seek and find common ground in all the practices that surround our putative artistic and aesthetic disputes. And the depth with which we engage in these critical debates, full of fervor, full of cajoling and revealing and transforming, it's just very, very hard to square with the idea that beauty is merely and entirely in the eye of each individual beholder. We must let simply 1,000 flowers bloom side by side by side, and that's all there is to say about that. But that is all I will say on this part of the subject, just by way of very general introduction, though I do have some tools and a case that we can work on together if you'd like. And to open up the floor, I guess one of the things I thought might be helpful, going back to something I presented earlier, is just to have you consider and share with us, if you like, the many ways your day's been shot through with the aesthetic or the artistic so far. And have those all been of similar significance or importance? Should we care if we actually have an agreement or disagreement about all of them? Which ones matter and why?